The sound a hand makes on a face is not the sound people think it is. It is not sharp. It is flat and low, and it goes into your skull instead of into the air. People expect to crack something clean, something that belongs in a film. It is not like that at all. It is a dull thing, a thud with weight behind it, and it does not leave when the hand leaves. It stays. It moves into the bone behind your ear, and it sets up house there. Months later, I could still hear it if a room got quiet enough. I could be standing at a sink with the water off or lying awake at 2 a.m, and there it would be that low, flat sound played back to me by a body that apparently decided it was worth keeping. I want to start there with the sound, because everybody who has ever heard this story wants to start with the sound. They lean in for it. I understand the instinct, but I need you to know from the first minute that the sound was the smallest part of what happened to me that June, and that it took me 3 more days to understand why. I was 68 years old. I was standing on a bluff above the Pacific with a folded paper napkin still in my left hand. I do not know why I was still holding the napkin. I had carried it out of the tent without thinking the way you carry small useless things when your hands want something to do, and I was still holding it when her palm landed, and I was still holding it after crushed now, damp at the edge from my own grip. There were 7 adults within 20 feet of me. I counted them later in my head, lying in the dark the way I count everything. 2 bridesmaids who had stepped out for a cigarette, a wedding planner in the mouth of a tent, a woman from the catering staff with a tray, 3 others whose faces I half knew and could not name. And there was a 7-year-old girl behind a cypress trunk with a shortbread cookie in her fist that I had given her 40 minutes earlier, watching through a gap in the bark with both hands coming up over her mouth. And there was my son. Bradley was 11 feet away, close enough that I could see the vein that stands up in his temple when he is upset, the one he has had since he was a boy. Close enough that he would not have needed to raise his voice. Close enough to reach me in 2 steps if 2 steps had ever occurred to him. He saw my head go sideways. He saw my shoulder come down on the fence rail. He saw the blood start at the corner of my mouth. He said nothing. That is the part people lean forward for later when I tell it. The slap. Everybody leans forward for the slap. And every time I have to stop them because the slap was not the thing. The slap was 1 bad second from 1 frightened person, and the world is full of bad seconds and frightened people. What my son did in the seconds after the slap was a different kind of thing entirely, a thing with planning behind it, and I did not understand what I had seen on his face until I was holding a photograph in my hand many weeks later. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is what happens when you have carried a thing this long. You want to say all of it at once. Let me back up and do this properly. I spent 38 years doing things properly. It is the only way I know. My name is Shanna Wilcox. For 38 years, I worked at Pacific Ridge Title in Portola Bend, California, which is a small salt-bitten town on the Central Coast where the fog comes over the ridge every afternoon at 4 and does not lift again until 10 or 11 the next morning, and where everyone has either always lived or arrived 40 years ago and never left. I am the first kind. I was born 9 miles from the house I'm going to tell you about. I started at the title company when I was 27. I retired 3 years ago at 65 with a sheet cake in the break room and a card everyone signed and 2 gifts, a plain round wall clock and a fountain pen with my name cut into the barrel. Both of those are in a drawer in my new house. I could not tell you why I keep them. I did not like the clock even when they gave it to me. Nobody grows up wanting to do what I did. When children are asked what they want to be, none of them says title officer. I did not say it either. But I will tell you what the work actually is, because the whole of this story rests on it, and if you do not understand the work, you will not understand how a 68-year-old woman with a bruised face and a bitten tongue took a family apart with a telephone and a public records portal, and a book that almost nobody knows exists. When you buy a house in this country, somebody has to go back through the paper. All of it. Every deed, every loan, every lien, every judgment, every easement, every divorce decree, every dead relative who never got properly taken off a document in 1971 and has been sitting on the title like a splinter ever since. Somebody has to build that chain link by link going back and back, and then somebody has to look at the whole chain and decide whether it holds, whether it is clean, whether the person selling the house actually owns the house all the way down with no gaps and no ghosts. For 38 years at Pacific Ridge Title that somebody was me. I read paper. That is the entire job stripped down. And I will tell you a thing about reading paper for 38 years that I did not fully appreciate until it saved my life, or at least saved my house, which at my age begins to feel like the same thing. After enough years, you stop reading the words. You start reading the shape of the thing. A nurse who has looked at 10,000 faces can walk into a room and know before a single test that the person in the bed is in trouble. It is the same with documents. A signature that sits a hair too high above the line. A notary block from a county nobody in the transaction has ever set foot in. A parcel number with a single digit transposed. A date that falls on a Sunday when the office it claims to come from is closed on Sundays. You feel the wrongness before you can name it. Your eye snags and your stomach goes cool, and only afterward does the front of your mind catch up and tell you what your training already knew. I caught 2 forged deeds in 38 years. Only 2. That is not because forgery is rare. It is because forgery is usually caught by nobody at all, which is the entire problem, and which is the reason I ended up giving away $250,000 at the end of this. But again, I am getting ahead of myself. The first forgery I caught was in 1994, and it was clumsy, and I will not spend time on it. The second was in 2011, and I have never once forgotten it, and I need to tell you about it now at the beginning, because it is load-bearing. It is the reason I did what I did in a parked car at 10:50 at night, with a phone held out at arm's length in front of my own ruined face. There was a man named Warren Pruitt. He was 83. He was in a memory care facility outside Atascadero, a good one, the kind with a garden and a piano nobody plays. He had a nephew. The nephew came to visit more than anyone else, which the staff found touching and which turned out to be a business decision. Over the course of a spring, that nephew brought his uncle a series of documents to sign and told him each one was an insurance form, and Warren Pruitt, who had built houses with his own hands for 50 years and had trusted family his entire life, signed them. One of them was a deed. By the time anybody at my company caught it sitting in the chain on an unrelated refinance, that old man had been off the title to his own home for 5 months and did not know it. The house had already moved once. There was a buyer in the picture who had paid real money and knew nothing. I sat in a conference room while a deputy district attorney explained to Warren Pruitt's daughter which section of the California Penal Code they intended to charge the nephew under and why. And I watched her face while she understood slowly that the reason her father was going to have such a hard fight to get his own house back was very simple and almost unbearable. There was no record. Nobody had written anything down while it was happening. Everything the family had was a memory of a thing assembled after the fact, and a memory of a thing in a courtroom is worth almost nothing. Evidence made at the time is the only evidence nobody can argue with. Everything else is a story you tell later, and stories told later can be picked apart by anyone with a suit and an hourly rate. I put that in the front of this account on purpose. Warren Pruitt. Remember him. He is the reason I did not scream on that bluff, and he is the reason I photographed my own bruise before I let myself cry. And it turned out I did not cry at all that night, but that was the plan, that I would document first and feel later. Feel later has always been my way. Some people would call that a flaw. On the 18th of June, it was the only thing I had. Now let me tell you about the people, because you cannot understand a betrayal without understanding what there was to betray. I married Dale Wilcox when I was 26. He was a lineman for the electric co-op, and he was the calmest man I have ever been in a room with. He could sit in a silence for an hour and never once make the silence feel like a punishment, which if you have ever lived with a person who cannot do that, you will know is close to a miracle. He climbed poles for a living. He came home smelling of ozone and creosote and cut grass. He read 3 pages of a paperback Western every night and never once in 13 years finished a book. Bradley came when I was 34. We had 9 years, the 3 of us. 9 years is not enough. I want that written down. 9 years is not nearly enough, and I have never forgiven the arithmetic. Then Dale went up a pole out on Ranch Road 9 during a wet spring in a splice that somebody else had made 12 years earlier badly in a hurry on a Friday afternoon. Most likely the way these things always happen on a Friday afternoon. Let go while he had his hands on the line. It was fast. I have held on to fast for 25 years because fast is the one mercy in it, and I take my mercies where they are offered. Bradley was 9. At the funeral, in a borrowed navy blazer with the sleeves too long, he stood next to me at the graveside, and he asked me a question that I have turned over more than any other sentence in my life. He asked whether we were still a family if there were only 2 of us. I knelt down in the wet grass in my funeral dress, and I told him that a family was whatever number of people were still showing up. That 2 was a family. That 1 was a family if 1 was all there was. That the number was never the point, that the showing up was the whole of it. I believed that when I said it. I still believe it. But I want you to notice, because it matters later, that I built my entire idea of family around a single word, and the word was showing up. And there is a version of this story where the cruelest thing that happened to me was not the hand across my face, but the discovery in my son's own handwriting of exactly how carefully he had planned not to show up. I raised him alone from 9 to 18 on a title officer's salary in a coastal town where everything costs more than it should. This is the place in the story where a woman my age is supposed to open the drawer and start laying out her sacrifices like receipts on a counter. The double shifts. The Christmases stretched thin. The car kept alive with tape and prayer. I am not going to do that. I want to be very clear that I am not going to do that, and that my refusal is not modesty. It is accuracy. I liked raising him. I liked the noise of the house and the muddy cleats by the back door, and the way he would read the sports page out loud to me at the counter on a Sunday morning, because he had decided at the age of 11 on no evidence whatsoever that I was ignorant about baseball and needed educating. I liked being needed by a person who was becoming someone. I would do every single year of it again exactly as it was, and I would count myself lucky. That is not the complaint. The complaint comes later, and it is a different complaint, and it is not that I gave too much. It is that I was asked at the end to give the one thing that was never on offer by people who had already decided that my saying no did not count. The house was ours from the beginning. 214 Larkspur Street. A 1912 craftsman on 6/10 of an acre out at the end of the road where Larkspur runs out of pavement and turns to gravel, and then just turns to bluff and stops. Dale and I bought it in 1984 for a number so small that when I say it out loud to young people now, they think I am making a joke at their expense. We were not rich. We were a lineman and a title clerk. But it was a different country then, and the house was old and needed everything, and we did everything slowly over years on weekends with our own hands. I paid it off in 2003, 6 years after Dale died alone with a cashier's check that I drove to the bank myself. And then I drove home and I sat in my own driveway in my own car for 20 minutes, not going in because there was nobody left inside the house to tell. That is the loneliest thing money has ever bought me, that paid off house and nobody to tell. I want you to hold on to that too, because a great many people were about to have a great many opinions about how much house one woman needs. There was a fig tree in the back that Dale planted the first spring, and that never once in 40 years produced a single fig. There was a rectangle of lawn near the fence where the grass came in a slightly different green than the grass around it, because that is where Bradley's swing set stood for 11 years, and the ground remembers a thing like that long after the thing is gone. That is what the property was to me. That is what those 6/10 of an acre held. In a few minutes, somebody is going to stand in front of me and tell me what that same property was to her. And I need you to understand that the two of us were looking at exactly the same 6/10 of an acre and seeing two entirely different things, and that the gap between what I saw and what she saw is the whole of this story, and it is a gap of more than $1 million. And I did not know the gap existed until she opened her mouth and told me a number. Bradley met Whitney Rodmaker a little over 2 years before the wedding. She was 31. She was a transaction coordinator at a real estate brokerage 2 towns up the highway, which means if you do not know the trade that she moved files. Contracts, disclosures, timelines, addenda, the whole machinery of a sale that happens behind the agent out of sight of the buyers, in a windowless back room with a coffee maker. It is not glamorous work. It is exacting work. You have to be organized in a specific, relentless, deadline-driven way, and she was. And I recognized it in her the first time I met her, because it was my own kind of organized. I should have looked harder at what a person does with that kind of mind. Instead, I felt a small pull of kinship, and I let the kinship do my thinking for me, which is a mistake I have spent a career warning other people not to make. The first time Bradley brought her to the house, she stood in the middle of my front room, and turned a slow half circle with her hands pushed into the back pockets of her jeans, and she said, "Wow." And I felt something warm because I thought she was looking at the ocean through the back windows, the way people do the first time, the way I still did after 37 years. She was not looking at the ocean. I understood that later, replaying it the way you replay everything later. Her eyes had gone up to the ceiling height, to the original crown casings that Dale and I stripped 4 coats of paint off of over one long winter, and then across to the back wall of windows, and then out past the glass to the yard, to the depth of the lot, to the length of it, running back to the bluff. She was not seeing a home. She was doing a walkthrough. She was pricing it. And I stood in my apron in the doorway with a dish towel in my hand, and I filed the whole thing under nothing because a young woman admiring an old house is not a crime, and because I badly, foolishly wanted to like the woman my son loved. Bradley used to come for breakfast on Sundays. That was ours. It had been ours since he was small, and it survived college, and it survived his first apartment, and it survived a great deal. Eggs, the sourdough from the place on Mission Street that has been there longer than he has been alive, and the sports page which he read aloud to me across the counter still at 32, because the joke had calcified into a ritual, and neither of us would have known how to stop it. After Whitney, the Sundays thinned. It happened the way these things happen, which is to say slowly and with perfectly reasonable explanations, so that there is never a single Sunday you can point to and say that one that is where it started. First, it was every other week because they had her mother's thing or a thing with her friends or a thing they could not quite name. Then it was a text at 9:40 in the morning while the eggs were already in the pan saying they could not make it after all. Then, by that last spring, it was simply understood that I should not count on it, and I stopped setting out 2 plates, and I started making coffee for one, and pouring half the pot down the sink, which is a small daily grief that I do not recommend, and that I told absolutely no one about. I never said a word to him about the thinning Sundays. I want to be honest about why, because the reason is not flattering, and it turns out to matter. It was not that I am gracious, or that I did not want to be a burden, or any of the noble things a woman is supposed to feel. It was fear. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, if I said, "Bradley, I miss you," if I said, "Where did you go?" he would agree with me. He would say yes. I have been away, and then it would be true out loud in the room, and I did not know how to survive it being true. So I kept it in. I have kept a great many things in over the years. It is a skill, and it is a defect, and on the 18th of June it was for once exactly the right tool for the job. He still had a key to the house. I had given it to him on his 18th birthday, and I never asked for it back, and I never had a single reason to in 16 years. That is a normal thing for a mother to do. I want that written down plainly and without irony because of where this goes, because there is a Sunday coming the 10th of May when that key is going to matter enormously, and I do not want anyone to hear about the key later and think I was careless. I was not careless. I raised a son and I gave him a key to his own home, and I would have thought less of myself for doing anything else. The failure when it came was not mine. I need that on the record, too. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in June at Tannery Bluff Ranch. It is a working cattle spread up the coast that started renting out its eucalyptus grove for weddings about 15 years ago, when ranching stopped paying and weddings started to. It is a beautiful place, genuinely fog permitting. There were going to be 140 guests. When Bradley told me the venue, he said it the way you say a thing you already know you cannot afford. He got the words out, and then he looked down at the table, at his own hands, at anything but me. And I did the thing I have done his entire life. The thing that a certain kind of mother cannot stop doing, even when she can see in real time that it is a mistake. I said I would take care of it. He said, "Mom, you do not have to do that." I said, "I know I do not." That exchange is the hinge of my whole life, and I did not hear it swing. Here is what nobody at that wedding knew, including my son, including up until the moment I told him on the telephone the next day. In April, I walked into a bank branch in San Luis Obispo, sat down across a desk from a young loan officer who called me ma'am, in a way that was meant kindly and landed like a small, cold stone, and I opened a home equity line of credit against 214 Larkspur Street for $90,000. In May, I drew $62,000 of it. That is where the wedding came from. All of it. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the 4-piece band, the shuttle vans to bring the guests up from the hotel, the tent liner, the $800 of warm string lights strung through the eucalyptus, which I will admit I looked at for a long time on the night of the rehearsal and thought, worth it, those alone are worth it. 62,000 borrowed dollars secured against a house I had bled to pay off in my name, and my name only with a repayment schedule. I had worked out in pencil on a yellow legal pad at my own counter, and every single intention of meeting for the rest of my life. I told no one. I let 140 people believe that the mother of the groom simply had savings, that this was easy for me, that it came out of some quiet reserve of comfortable widow money. I let my own son believe it. And I told myself that the reason was pride, that I did not want to be pitied. That was not the reason. I have had a long time to sit with the real reason alone on a porch, and I owe you the true version. The real reason is that if Bradley had known the money was borrowed against the house, he might have said no. He might have stopped me. He might have insisted on something smaller. something we could actually afford, and I did not want smaller. I wanted to hand my son one enormous, gleaming, unreasonable thing before I got too old to hand him anything. One gift big enough to say all the things I have never been able to say out loud, and I hid the cost so that no one, least of all me, would have to weigh whether it was wise. That is the flaw. It is right there. I built the trap myself out of love with my own 2 hands, and I baited it with a house, and then I stood in a foggy grove in a navy blouse and watched other people spring it. The rehearsal dinner was Friday the 18th of June. I have been to a great many events in my life, and I can tell you the weather of almost none of them. But I can tell you the weather of that evening in complete detail, because a body remembers the day it changes. The fog came in early that afternoon, earlier than usual, thick and low off the water, and by 6 o'clock, the whole eucalyptus grove was drowned in it. The string lights had that soft doubled look they take on in wet air, each bulb wearing a second smaller ghost of itself, a halo you could put your hand into. The bark of the eucalyptus was peeling in long pale ribbons, and the whole grove smelled of it, that clean, sharp, medicinal smell mixed with salt, mixed with the char of the caterer's grill somewhere off behind the tent. I got there at 5:40. I am always early. 38 years of recording deadlines to the minute will do that. To a person will build it into you so deep that you cannot arrive at your own son's rehearsal dinner without being the first one there. Gail Hutchins met me at the gravel turnaround with a black clipboard held flat against her chest, the way she held it against her chest every time I ever saw her, like a breastplate. She was the events director. Early 50s, a wide streak of gray at one temple that she was not hiding and had clearly decided not to hide, which told me most of what I needed to know about her before she said a word. She was a woman who had stopped being impressed by weddings years ago and had started instead being impressed by logistics, by whether the thing ran by, whether the vans came on time, and I liked her on sight for it. She said, "Mrs. Wilcox, you are the first one here again." I said, "I am always the first one here." She gave me half a smile and went back to her clipboard. And I want you to hold that ordinary little exchange in your mind, because in exactly 15 hours I was going to telephone that woman and say something to her that no vendor in the wedding business ever wants to hear, and she was going to be quiet for 4 seconds, and then she was going to say yes. And more than that, she was going to give me a piece of information unasked that redirected the entire course of my life. But that is tomorrow. On this night, she was just a competent woman with a clipboard being kind to an early guest. Whitney arrived at 6:15 in a white dress. Not the dress. A different white dress. A rehearsal dress, because there is apparently a rule now that a bride wears white to the party before the party, too. Her ash blonde hair was up in a tight, elaborate twist that had clearly cost someone 2 hours with no strand out of place, which I noted the way I note everything, because a woman whose hair does not move is a woman who intends to be in control of the evening. Her mother came in behind her. Darlene Raidmaker, 66 years old. A soft lavender cardigan, reading glasses on a small beaded chain around her neck. The whole soft, pleasant apparatus of a certain kind of older woman, the kind who touches your forearm when she talks to you, who calls you honey inside the first minute. She touched my forearm. She said, "Shauna, this is all so lovely. You have done a beautiful thing here." I said thank you, and I meant it all the way down. I remember thinking with actual relief that whatever happened with the couple, whatever friction there was, at least the mothers were going to be all right. At least there would be one warm, easy older woman across the aisle from me at Christmases for the rest of my life. I need you to remember that she said that to me. I need you to remember her hand on my arm and the wine in her other hand, and the kindness on her round, pleasant face in that grove. That is all I am asking of you right now. Just remember it, and set it aside, and I will come back for it, because that woman is the center of this, and I did not know it, and I was grateful to her, and that gratitude is a thing I have had to make my peace with. The rehearsal itself took 40 minutes. Bradley missed his mark twice, walking to the wrong spot under the arch, and both times Whitney laughed and corrected him, and both times the laugh landed a half-second late, the way a laugh does when it has been decided upon rather than felt when it is a tool being used rather than a sound coming out. I heard the lateness in it. I did not know yet what it meant. I filed it the way I file everything in the drawer of small wrong things to come back to. Then everyone went into the long tables under the tent, and I went to find my seat. I found it at the far end. Table 9. Back row pressed up against the canvas wall of the tent between a second cousin of Dale's who had driven up from Bakersfield, and whom I had met perhaps 4 times in my life, and a man whose name I never did learn across an entire dinner. The head table had 12 chairs. I counted them twice because I am a person who counts. and I wanted to be sure I was not being unfair, that I was not seeing a slight where there was only an oversight. 12 chairs, the bride, the groom, the maid of honor, 2 aunts, a college roommate, and her husband, a man from Whitney's brokerage, the best man, Darlene, and 2 more I could not place. 12, and not one of them for me. There was no chair for me anywhere near my son on the last night of his life, as only my son on the night I had paid 62 borrowed $1,000 to make beautiful. I put my napkin in my lap, and I sat down at table 9, and I did not say one single word about it. Not to the cousin from Bakersfield, not to the nameless man, not to anyone then or after. Around the salad course, Whitney's uncle stood and raised his glass and made a toast to the beautiful evening and the beautiful setting and the beautiful couple, and 140 people lifted their glasses and drank to Tannery Bluff Ranch. Nobody said where the evening had come from. That is fine. I did not need a speech, and I want to be very clear that I did not want one, that I would have been mortified by one. But I will tell you that I remember the exact temperature of that moment, the precise degree of it, when 140 people toasted a thing I had mortgaged my home to give them, and not one of them knew it. And the person who knew it least of all was the groom, my son, standing at the center of the head table in a suit I had also paid for raising his glass with the rest. Cassie was the flower girl. She was 7 Whitney's niece, in a stiff white dress with a crinoline underskirt that she plainly hated, tugging at the waist of it every few minutes. Around 8:30, the noise in the crowd got to be too much for her, the way it does for a small person at a large, loud event, and she went to the edge of the grove and put her back flat against one of the cypress trunks, and stood there half-hidden, riding it out. I know that trick. I invented that trick. I have been leaving loud rooms and putting my back against solid things my whole life. I went over with a shortbread cookie out of my purse because I am 68 years old and I have not attended a single event in perhaps 40 years without a cookie somewhere in my purse. And I got down as far as my knees would take me, which is not as far as it used to be, and I said, "It is loud out here." She said, "It is really loud." I said, "You are allowed to stand behind a tree. That is not against the rules." She considered this with great seriousness, and then she took the cookie, and she asked me if I was the grandma. I said, "Not yet." I said, "Ask me again tomorrow." She laughed, and there was a gap in the front of her smile where a tooth had recently gone, and the laugh was real, an actual child's laugh in a grove full of practiced adult ones. And I have thought since that it was the last genuinely uncomplicated sound I heard that night, that little girl laughing at a tree joke with a cookie in her fist. Everything after it had a second thing hidden underneath. I have never been sorrier about anything in my life than I am about the fact that a 7-year-old saw what she saw 20 minutes later. I want to say that here near her in the story because it belongs near her. At 8:50, Whitney found me by the dessert table. She had a champagne flute in her hand with about an inch left in it. She put her other hand on my elbow, light and friendly, the way her mother had touched my forearm 2 hours earlier, and I have wondered since whether she learned that touch from Darlene, or whether it simply runs in a certain kind of family, the reassuring hand on the older woman's arm, the small physical claim of intimacy that opens the door for the thing they actually want to say. She said, "Shanna, walk with me a second. It is too loud in here." She walked me out of the tent, past the line of cypress, out to where the mowed grass stops, and the split-rail fence runs along the very top of the bluff. The fog had lifted just enough by then to show the water below black and moving. The band was still doing its sound check back behind us, and the music came across the wet grass, thin and far away, like something remembered rather than heard. She said, "Tomorrow is going to change everything for Bradley and me." I said, "I know it is." She said, "That is what I want to talk to you about." And then she said it. And here is the thing, I was not ready for the thing that has stayed with me longer than the slap. She said it kindly. She said it the way you would suggest a restaurant to someone. Warmly, reasonably, with her head tilted a little to one side. She said, "We want you to sign the house over to us." I did not say anything. She said before the wedding, "Tonight if you can manage it. Tomorrow morning at the very latest." I said, "Whitney." She said, "Shanna, listen. You are 68. That property is 6/10 of an acre, and you are one person rattling around on it. You cannot do those stairs forever, you know, you cannot. You cannot keep up that yard. And Bradley grew up in that house. It means something to him. It should have children in it again, real children, not just a woman on her own." Every word of it was a sentence I had read before. Not heard, read, in a file. In somebody else's file coming out of somebody else's daughter-in-law in a dispute I had watched cross my desk at the title company. The exact language old alone too much house cannot do the stairs should have a family in it. I had seen it in writing before I ever heard it out loud on a bluff, and that is the only reason I recognized it for what it was, which is a script, though. I would not fully understand that it was a script until the next afternoon when I heard 3 more mouths recite it. I said that house is not for sale and it is not forgiving, and she got impatient. Just slightly. Just enough. The kindness slipped a 1/4 inch the way a mask slips, and I saw the edge of the real thing behind it. She said, "Be realistic. Do you have any idea what that parcel is worth?" I said, "I have a fair idea. It is a 1912 house in a slow market. Call it 1.4. And Whitney Raidmaker made a small, amused sound in her throat, a little exhale of contempt, and she said 1.4. Try again. That parcel is north of 2.5. The fog moved. The band behind us stopped. I want to explain as precisely as I can what happened inside my body in the second after she said that number, because it was not what you would expect, and it is the true beginning of everything that follows. It was not grief. It was not anger. Those came later in their own time, in their own order. What arrived in that second, cold and complete, was recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has read paper for 38 years and has just heard a number that does not belong to the object it is attached to. A house does not jump from 1.4 to 2.5. A house cannot do that. A house is lumber and copper, and a roof and a comparable sail down the street, and it moves in increments, and it moves slowly, and it never ever leaps $1 million in a market that is not moved. I knew that the way I know my own name. I have watched thousands of houses fail to do exactly the thing Whitney had just told me my house had done. Only land does that. Land does that. Land leaps like that when the rules underneath it change, when somebody redraws a line on a zoning map, when a lot that could legally hold 1 single-family home can suddenly subject to review hold 4. That was not a house number she had given me. That was an entitlement number, a developer's number, a number with a density study behind it, which meant that the young woman standing in front of me in a white rehearsal dress with an inch of champagne in her hand knew something about my land that I did not know. She had a figure, not a guess, not a round, friendly estimate, a specific figure with a floor under it, delivered fast and delivered certain in the flat, confident cadence that people use only when they are repeating a number they have seen written down. And in the same cold second, a second thing arrived, and this one arrived with a kind of horror underneath the cold. You do not ask for a gift the night before a wedding. Nobody does that. It is the worst possible timing in the entire world. The bride is booked solid, the guests have landed, the rehearsal is running, the morning is going to be chaos. There is no worse moment to raise a large, delicate request than the eve of the event itself, unless the timing is not yours to choose, unless there is a date, unless something outside this grove, something with its own calendar, was pressing on Whitney Raidmaker hard enough that she was willing to walk her fiancé's mother out to a fence in the fog on the worst possible night to demand a house. I looked at her face, and I thought very clearly in words, this is not greed. Greed is patient. Greed waits until after the honeymoon. Greed would never risk the whole wedding on a Friday night ask. This is a deadline. I said, Whitney, how do you know that number? Her chin came up about 1/4 inch. It is a small thing, 1/4 inch of chin, but I have spent my life reading small things, and that 1/4 inch told me I had touched exactly the nerve I meant to touch. She said, are you going to sign or not? I said no. She said, Shauna. I said no. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. And now I would like you to tell me who ran that number and when. And she hit me. Open hand, full arm, no wind up at all, which is precisely how I know she had been at that place already inside herself before she ever walked me out there. You do not swing like that from a standing start. You swing like that when you have already arrived at violence in your mind and are only waiting for a reason. My head went right. My glasses left my face and went into the grass. My shoulder came down on the top rail of the split rail fence hard enough that I felt the old splinters go through the sleeve of my blouse and into the skin. I bit my tongue. That is where the blood came from, in case you were wondering the way everyone always wonders. Not a split lip. My tongue caught between my teeth when my head snapped. It filled the whole left side of my mouth with a taste like a fistful of old pennies. The sound came second. It always does, the flat, low sound arriving a half beat after the blow, and then there was nothing at all, a great ringing, nothing, and it was very quiet on that bluff. Gail Hutchins was standing in the mouth of the tent with her clipboard still flat against her chest and her mouth open. The 2 bridesmaids were frozen 12 feet off their cigarettes, forgotten and burning down toward their fingers. And Cassie was behind the cypress trunk with both small hands clamped over her mouth and her eyes enormous, And I saw her in that first ringing second before I saw anything else, and I have carried her face out of that grove, and I will carry it the rest of my life. And then my son came running out of the tent. He stopped 4 feet short. He looked at my face. My glasses were in the grass, and my cheek was already coming up hot, and there was blood on my chin, and Bradley looked directly at all of it, took it in, registered it. Then he looked at Whitney, and then he did the thing. He looked down, at his own wrist, at his watch. It took about a second and a half, maybe less, and I cataloged it the way I have cataloged 10,000 small wrong things on 10,000 pages, without understanding it, without being able to say what it meant, simply marking it, folding down the corner of it to come back to. His mother was standing in front of him, bleeding a hand mark rising on her face, and my son checked the time. He said, "Mom." That was the whole of it. One word. And then nothing, and the nothing went on and on and on. Whitney said, "Tell her." Bradley did not tell me anything. He stood in the wet grass in his good shoes, with his hands hanging half open at his sides. And I watched a 34-year-old man decide in front of 6 witnesses that this was simply not his to speak into. That the safest thing, the most manageable thing, was to say nothing and let it settle and deal with the logistics of it later. I bent down. My knees are not what they were, and I will not pretend I retrieved my glasses gracefully, because I did not. I got them out of the grass and I put them on, and one arm was bent so that they sat crooked and low on my face, tilted absurd. And I left them crooked. I made a decision in that half second that I was not going to stand on a bluff in front of these people and fuss with my glasses, that I would not give them the small satisfaction of watching me try to put myself back in order. Crooked was fine. Crooked was dignity of a strange kind. I smoothed the front of my skirt with both palms. I said good night. That is all I said. 2 words. And I turned and I walked back through the tent, straight down the center of it, past table 9, past the head table with its 12 chairs, past 140 people who had heard a sound they could not quite place, and had most of them already gone back to their salmon. Darlene Raidmaker was at the head table with her hand resting on the stem of her wine glass, and she watched me the whole way down the tent, and when I drew even with her, she said, "Shauna, honey, is everything all right?" I said, "Everything is fine." She said, "You are pale as a sheet." I said, "It is the fog." Remember that she said that to me. "You are pale as a sheet." The soft, concerned voice, the reading glasses on the beaded chain, the hand on the wine. Remember it. I am going to come back for it. I walked out across the gravel and I got into my car, and I locked all 4 doors, and I sat there in the dark with the engine off. And that is where my hands finally went. They had held together through the slap, through the walk, through the good night, and the moment the doors locked, they came apart. They shook so hard I could not get the key into the slot, and I stopped trying, and I let them shake, both of them, flat on my thighs for what was probably 90 seconds, and felt like a great deal longer. I did not cry. I want to be accurate about that, because it was not strength, it was not composure. It was simply that there was nothing available, that my whole body had emptied itself into that cold recognition at the fence, and there was nothing left over to make tears out of. I sat in that gravel lot until almost 11 o'clock. It was not deliberation. It was the plain animal fact that I could not yet make my hands do anything at all, and I was not going to drive on that highway in that fog with hands like that. And then sometime around 10:45, with the string lights still burning in my rearview mirror, 38 years of my working life came up out of the floor of me and took the wheel. I reached up and I turned on the dome light. I got out my phone, and I held it at arm's length in front of my own face, and I took 11 photographs of it. The bruise, the blood, the crooked glasses, the whole ruin in the flat yellow light of a parked car. I want to tell you how that felt, because it is the single strangest thing I have ever done. It felt obscene. It felt like something a broken person does. Sitting in a parking lot at 10:50 at night, photographing your own cheek while your ear is still ringing with a sound that will not leave. I did it anyway. I did it because of Warren Pruitt. I did it because I had sat in that conference room and watched a family lose the fight before it started, for the simple reason that no one had written anything down while it was happening, that everything they had was a story assembled later. Evidence made at the time is the only evidence nobody can argue with. So I made evidence at the time in a parked car with shaking hands, 11 frames of it. Then I started the engine, and I did not drive home. I drove 9 miles south to the urgent care clinic that sits on the highway between the tire place and the shuttered bowling alley, and I walked in at 11:15 at night, and the girl at the desk asked me the nature of my visit. I said I was struck in the face this evening by my son's fiancée. I would like it documented. I would like the time on it. She stopped chewing her gum. The physician assistant who saw me was maybe 30, and he was gentle, and he photographed my cheek, and the inside of my mouth, and the straight rail-shaped bruise across the top of my shoulder, and he asked me twice whether he should call the police from the clinic. Both times I said no. I told him I would do it myself in the morning, and that I wanted it done right in order by me so that no part of it could ever be called hysteria after the fact. He wrote all of it down: time of injury, mechanism, witnesses present, patient statement, 2 pages of it. And then he said the only thing anyone said to me that entire night that got past the ringing and actually reached me. He said, "Is there somebody who can come stay with you tonight?" And I sat on that paper-covered table with my glasses still crooked on my face, and I thought about the true answer to that question. There was a woman named Loretta Pike who had lived across my back fence for 19 years, and who would have come in a heartbeat in her bathrobe without a single question if I had ever once in 19 years called her after 8 o'clock at night. And there was my son 11 miles up the coast in a hotel who had 3 hours earlier checked his watch. I said no, there is not. I drove home. I let myself into a house I had lived in for 37 years and paid off with my own hands, and that spring quietly borrowed $62,000 against. And I stood in the dark front room without turning on a single lamp, and I put my palm flat against the plaster wall beside the light switch the way I have done 10,000 times coming in at night, and I said out loud to no one in an empty house the sentence that started everything that comes after. I said, "Who pulled the number?" Because a slap is a slap. A slap is one bad second from one frightened person, and I could have survived a slap. I could have folded a slap into the long list of things a life does to you and gone on. But a figure like that does not come out of the air. It does not appear in a young woman's mouth on a foggy bluff by accident. It comes off a page. Somebody typed it. Somebody sent it. Somebody had a reason to run it, and somebody somewhere had a reason to want my signature on a document before a specific Saturday in June. And I was going to find out who and when and on what piece of paper. I am going to tell you the next part flat in the order I found it out, because that is the only honest way to tell it. By the time that woman hit me on the bluff, I had already not owned my house for 11 days. I just did not know it yet. I slept about 2 hours that night in a chair without meaning to, and I woke at 4 in the morning with my neck locked to one side and the taste of old pennies still in the corner of my mouth. I did not lie there. I have never once in my life gotten anything out of lying there. I got up, and I went to my counter and I put on one small lamp and I sat down with a yellow legal pad, and I did the thing I have done at the start of every hard day of my adult life. I made a list, not a list of feelings. I want to be very clear about that, because if I had sat down at 4 in the morning and made a list of my feelings, it would have been 1 line long and entirely useless. I made a list of paper. That is a different thing, and it is the thing that saved me. I wrote down every single arrangement I had made for that wedding, and next to each one, I wrote whose name was on it. Venue, caterer, florist, band, shuttle vans, tables and rentals, bar service, lighting. 12 lines when I was done, and my name on 11 of them. Bradley's name on exactly one the hotel room block which he had put on his own card because I had told him 2 months ago, wanting him to feel like a man handling one piece of his own wedding. Then, underneath the list, I wrote 3 more lines. Report it, freeze it, stop paying for it. In that order. And it matters enormously that it was in that order, and I will tell you why as we go, but the short version is this: a frightened person stops the money first, because money is the thing that feels most urgent. A person who has read paper for 38 years reports it first, because the police report is the thing that will exist forever. The thing that will still be true in a courtroom a year from now, and money can always be stopped an hour later. But a report made an hour late is a report made after you had time to calm down and think, which is a report a defense lawyer can do things to. Report, freeze, stop paying. I circled it once, and I sat and watched the light come up gray in the window over the sink. By 5:40, the sun was up over the ridge, and I could see myself properly in the hall mirror. My cheek had gone the deep bruised color of a bad plum purple, going yellow at the edges with a real swelling under the eye. My jaw would not open all the way, and it clicked when I tried. And my shoulder, when I pulled my collar aside, was worse than my face. There was a bruise across the top of it, a straight, clean, horizontal line exactly the width of the top rail of a fence printed into me like a stamp. I looked at that one for a long time. It was in a strange way the most useful injury I had, because a straight line the width of a fence rail is not a thing a person does to herself, and is not a thing that happens by accident, and a photograph of it taken at a clinic at 11:15 the night before is a hard, cold fact that argues with no one. I put on a blouse with a collar. I pinned my silver hair up neatly the way I wear it to work, the way I have worn it to every serious thing in my life. I did not try to cover the bruise. Covering it would have been a decision, and I did not want to have made any decisions about how the bruise looked. I wanted it seen in the daylight by professionals exactly as it was. Then I drove to the Porto La Bend police station, and I walked in at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning. The lobby was empty. There was a young officer behind the reception glass, eating a wrapped breakfast sandwich, and when he looked up and saw my face, he set the sandwich down and did not pick it up again for the entire time I was there, which I noticed and which told me the bruise was doing its job. He said, "Ma'am, do you need medical attention?" I said I had medical attention last night. I have the discharge paperwork with me. I am here to make a report. He got a form. He asked me what happened. And here is the part I had rehearsed in the car on the drive down, word by word, because after 38 years in an office where words are the entire product, where a single wrong word in a legal description can cloud a title for a decade, I know a thing that most people walking into that lobby do not know. I know that the words you choose in the first 4 minutes decide what the file becomes. The file is built out of your first sentences, and it is very hard to rebuild later. Most women my age walk into that lobby and they say my daughter-in-law slapped me. And I understand why, because it is true, and because it is what happened, and because they are hurt, and they want to say the hurt out loud. But that sentence does two terrible things. It sounds domestic. It sounds like a family argument. And the instant a report sounds like a family argument, it goes quietly into the drawer where family arguments go to be managed, and de-escalated and forgotten, and no one is ever charged with anything. So I did not say that. I stood at the counter and I said at approximately 8:50 last night at Tannery Bluff Ranch in the presence of at least 6 adult witnesses and 1 minor child. A 31-year-old woman named Whitney Rademacher demanded that I transfer real property to her, and when I refused, she struck me in the face with an open hand hard enough to knock me into a fence rail and draw blood. And then I said the second sentence, the one I had built the whole thing around. I said I am 68 years old. She knows my age. She stated my age out loud to me twice as her reason in the 30 seconds before she hit me. The officer stopped writing. He looked up. He said she said your age out loud. I said she opened with it. She said, "You are 68. You cannot do the stairs. You are one person on all that property." My age was her entire argument. He said, "Hold on a second," and he got up and went and got a sergeant. Let me explain why I said that second sentence. Because it was not instinct. It was memory, and it is Warren Pruitt again reaching forward across 10 years to help me. When my company turned that old man's file over to the district attorney in 2011, I sat in a conference room and listened to a deputy DA explain to Warren's daughter which section of the penal code they were going to charge the nephew under, and why that section was so much better for her father than a plain theft charge. Elder abuse. Penal Code Section 368. It applies when the victim is 65 or older, and the person doing the harm knows it or reasonably should. And it is what they call a wobbler, which means the prosecutor can file it as a misdemeanor or as a felony, depending entirely on what the file looks like when it lands on the desk. And I have never forgotten the exact sentence the deputy said next. He said the whole case turns on whether we can prove she knew how old he was. Whitney Rademacher had told me my own age on that bluff twice in front of 6 witnesses, and had used it as the reason I should hand her a house. She had built the state's case against herself out of her own mouth, and she had done it because she was so completely certain that being 68 was nothing but a weakness, a soft place to push on, that it never once occurred to her that being 68 might also be a category, a protected one, with its own section number. The sergeant took the rest of it herself. She was a solid, unhurried woman, and she photographed my face and my shoulder again in the better light of the station, and she took the clinic paperwork, and she took every name I could give her, Gail Hutchins, the 2 bridesmaids, the maid of honor. And she wrote down carefully that a 7-year-old child had been present, and she noted that I did not want that child interviewed unless there was no other way to make the case, and I was grateful to her for writing it down exactly like that. She gave me a case number on a small printed card. I still have the card. It lives in the drawer with the wall clock and the pen, and I cannot fully explain why I keep it, except that it was the first solid object I was handed in the whole ordeal, the first thing that was mine that said this happened, and here is its number. I was out of the station by 7:20. At 8 o'clock I called the bank, and that call took 4 minutes, and it mattered more than anything else I did that entire day. The line of credit was $90,000 against my house. I had drawn 62. There was $28,000 still sitting there, available undrawn, tied to a property that in 72 more hours I was going to discover was not on paper legally mine at all. I was the sole borrower. My name and no one else's on the whole instrument. I told the woman on the phone that I wanted the line frozen. No further draws, no checks, no card effective immediately, and a written confirmation mailed to my address. She asked me in the careful way they are trained to ask whether I had experienced fraud. I said I do not know yet. Ask me on Monday. She froze it while I was still on the line. $28,000 shut off at 4 minutes past 8 in the morning. At the time, I honestly believed I was just being cautious, tidying up a loose end. I was not. I have thought about this a great deal since, and the truth is that without knowing it, without understanding a single piece of what was actually happening, I had just quietly shut the last easy door between two families and a very large amount of money. That undrawn $28,000 was though I did not know it exactly the kind of loose cash that a plan like theirs needs to close a gap at the end, and I closed it off out of pure blind habit at 8 in the morning, and it is one of the small, ordinary reasons the whole thing came apart. At 9 o'clock, I called Gail Hutchins, and I need to walk through this one slowly because when people hear the short version, they hear a bitter woman canceling a wedding out of spite, and that is not what happened. And the difference between those two things is the difference between who they think I am and who I actually am. I could not cancel that wedding. Nobody can cancel a wedding. A wedding is not a thing you can cancel. It is 140 people and a license and a Saturday, and it exists whether I participate in it or not. What I could do, the only thing I could do, was stop being the person paying for it. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Mrs. Wilcox." Not hello. Just my name flat and low, the way you say the name of someone you have been thinking about all night and dreading hearing from. I said, "Gail, I need to ask you a business question, and I need you to answer it as the events director, and not as a person who feels badly for me." She said, "All right." I said on the venue contract who is the payer of record. There was a pause, and I heard paper move on the other end, and I knew from the exact sound of it, that particular slide of a file being turned toward a person, that the contract had already been open on her desk before I ever called, that she had been sitting with it since dawn waiting. She said, "You are." I said, "In the final balance. What is still outstanding?" She said, 14,200, bar final headcount staffing gratuity pool. It authorizes off your card automatically at noon today. I said, "Do not release it. I am revoking payment authorization in writing in the next 10 minutes, and I am going to copy the caterer and the band and the shuttle company and the rental yard, and then I am going to call each of them myself." She was quiet for 4 full seconds. And then she said, "Mrs. Wilcox, I have to be straight with you before you do this. You have already paid $62,000, and that money is gone. Every deposit in this file is non-refundable inside 30 days, and we are inside 12 hours. If you stop the balance now, you do not get any of it back. You just lose the day on top of the money. You walk away with nothing." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I want to be sure you do. You are not getting $62,000 back. Not any of it. Not a dollar." And I said the sentence I had been assembling since 4 o'clock that morning at my own counter in the dark with the legal pad. I said, "Gail, I am not trying to get my money back. That money is spent, and I spent it, and I would have spent it gladly right up until 9 o'clock last night. What I am trying to do is stop spending new money. I will not put one more borrowed dollar into a celebration for a woman who put her open hand in my face on a cliff. And I will not do it for a man who stood 4 feet away and watched her do it and looked at his watch." She said, "He did what?" I said, "Never mind. Do you need the revocation on letterhead?" She said, "No, ma'am, email is fine." And then after a moment, she said the thing that people say when a thing has moved them and they are trying to stay professional about it. She said, "I have planned 400 weddings, Mrs. Wilcox. I have never once had to call a bride the morning of and tell her she has no venue. I am going to enjoy exactly none of it. But I am not going to enjoy it one bit less because of you." And then right at the end, when I was already thanking her, when I thought we were done, Gail Hutchins said the thing that changed the entire direction of my life. She said, "Mrs. Wilcox, can I ask you something odd?" I said, "Of course." She said, 3 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law called this office and asked me to change the billing contact on this file from you to her. I sat down. I did not decide to sit down. There was a chair behind me, and then I was in it. I said, "Say that to me again." She said, "Late May. A Tuesday, I think. She called and she asked me to take your name off as the billing contact and put hers on instead. And when I told her I could not do that the contract runs with the payer, and I could not move it without the payer's signature, she asked me a second question. She asked whether the contract was assignable. I said she used that word, assignable. Gail said that is exactly why I remembered it, and why I am telling you. Brides do not say assignable. In 15 years, I have never had a bride say assignable. Brides say, can we just switch it over? Whitney said assignable, and she said it the way you say a word you use every day at work without even hearing yourself say it. She said I told her no, the payer has to sign anything that moves the file, and she said fine, no problem, thanks so much, and hung up. And I forgot about it entirely until about 2 o'clock this morning when I could not sleep, and it came back to me, and it has been sitting wrong in my stomach ever since. I said, Gail, was that the only thing she asked? Gail said no. She also asked whether we keep the payment records after the event and for how long. I want to describe to you what those 2 questions did to me, sitting in a chair in my own front room at 9:15 in the morning with a bruised face and a phone against my ear. 3 weeks before that bluff, before the slap, before any of it. Whitney Rademacher had been on this telephone trying to get my name off a piece of paper, not off the guest list, not out of the photographs, off a document in writing with a signature deliberately weeks in advance. And when she was told that it required my signature to move it, she had immediately asked how long the record of my payments would continue to exist. The demand on the bluff had not been the beginning of anything. It was not a spontaneous act of a nervous bride. It was somewhere in the middle of a thing that had been running for at least 3 weeks, and probably far longer, and I had just found the first thread of it by pure luck, because a wedding planner could not sleep, and a word had stuck in her memory. I thanked her, and I meant it more than she knew, and I hung up, and I sent the written revocation at 9:22 in the morning, and copied 5 vendors. And then I called all 5 of them, one after another, and every single one said some version of the same thing, which was, ma'am, we understand and we are sorry, but there are no refunds. And I said to each of them, I know. I am not asking for one. The last call was to the shuttle company. The dispatcher was a man about my own age, with a smoker's voice, and when I finished explaining, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, ma'am, can I ask, is somebody in trouble? I said, I am not sure yet. And he said, my mother is 81. And then he said, the vans are not rolling. Have a good day. And he hung up, and I sat with the phone in my lap for a minute, because kindness from a stranger arriving in the middle of a bad morning will do that to you. It will undo you faster than the cruelty does. That was the whole of it. 98 minutes from the police station lobby to the last phone call, and it cost me 62,000 borrowed dollars, and there was no clever contract clause, and no loophole, and no dramatic moment where I outsmarted anyone. I just stopped paying. That is all it ever was at the bottom. A woman stopped paying for a party. Everything else, all the noise that came after, was other people's reaction to the simplest thing in the world, which is a person deciding to keep her own money in her own pocket. The wedding was supposed to start at 4:30 that afternoon. At 11 o'clock my phone started, and it did not stop again until well after dark. Bradley called first. He called 9 times before I answered, and when I finally picked up, he did not say hello. He said, Mom, what did you do? Not are you all right? Not I am so sorry about last night. Not I have not slept either. 9 calls, and the first 4 words out of my son's mouth were, what did you do? I said, good morning, Bradley. He said the ranch called Whitney, the caterer called Whitney. There are 140 people my cousins flew in from Denver. You cannot do this. You cannot cancel my wedding. I said I have not canceled anything. You are 34 years old, and you are free to get married at 4:30 this afternoon, anywhere in this state that will have the 2 of you. What I have canceled is my participation in the bill. He said that is the same thing. I said no, it is not. And the fact that you cannot tell the difference between those 2 things is worth about $62,000 to me, and I would like you to sit with that for a moment. He said 62. I said yes. He said, where did you even get $62,000? And I told him. I said I borrowed it against the house in April. It is a line of credit. I have been making the payments on it since May out of my pension, and I never told you because I did not want you to feel the weight of it. The silence on the other end of that phone was about 6 seconds long, and I could hear him breathing, and I could hear behind him a woman's voice screaming something I could not make out in a hotel room. And then he said, oh, just that, oh. I want to be fair to my son at this one particular moment, because I am about to be very unfair to him for the rest of this account, and he has it coming every word of it. But I want to be fair right here at 9:15 on a Saturday morning. For about 3 seconds on that telephone, Bradley Wilcox was genuinely, completely horrified. I heard it. It was real. For 3 seconds, he understood exactly what his mother had done to herself out of love, and exactly what he and the woman he was marrying had been about to take, and the horror of it went all the way through him. And then Whitney took the phone. I will not repeat most of what she said, because most of it was not really sentences, it was volume. The parts that were words were about how I had ruined her life, and how everyone had always warned her I was exactly like this, and how I was a bitter old woman who could not bear to watch anyone else be happy. I let her run all the way out. I have learned over a long life that people who talk like that always finish eventually, if you simply wait, and that the finish is worth waiting for, because the very last thing out of the mouth is almost always the true thing, the thing under all the other things. The last thing out of Whitney's mouth was this. She said, "You have no idea what you have just cost us." Not cost me, not ruined my day, not humiliated me in front of everyone. Cost us. A number. A loss with a figure attached to it. I said, "Whitney, that is the first honest sentence you have said to me since March." And I hung up. Her mother called at 12:40, and I am going to give you Darlene's 3 sentences exactly word for word because I have gone over them more times since than is probably healthy for a person. She said, "Shauna, honey, it is Darlene." She said, "Whatever happened last night, I am sure it can all be undone." She said, "Please just call Whitney back before this afternoon." And then she hung up before I could answer, before I could say a single word. Undone. That was the word she used. At the time, I heard it as a warm and slightly useless thing that a mother says, the kind of soothing nothing you offer to smooth a bad moment over. And that is exactly how it is meant to land. That is the whole art of it. But I want you to hold on to that word undone and set it beside pale as a sheet from the night before. Because in about 3 weeks, I was going to be sitting on my own back porch with a small recorder running face down on the table between us. And that soft, harmless word was going to come back at me like a piece of broken glass turning up in a bare foot. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I made a decision that in hindsight was one of the smartest things I did in the whole affair. I left the house. Not out of fear, out of arithmetic. I knew that sooner or later somebody was going to come to my door, and I did not want the first version of that conversation to happen in my own front room where I would be cornered in it, where I could not simply stand up and walk away. So I put on a pair of sunglasses that did not remotely cover the bruise, and I drove downtown to the Anchor Room, which is a lunch counter 2 blocks off the water where I have eaten a Cobb salad most Saturdays for 20 years, and where the girl who brought my water looked at my face and blessedly asked me nothing. I got about 11 minutes. Then the door opened and 3 people came in, and it was Bradley and 2 of Whitney's aunts. They had been to my house, first I learned later. They had knocked for 6 full minutes and then called out over the back fence to Loretta Pike to ask where I was. And Loretta, God love her, to the end of her days told them she had absolutely no idea while looking directly at the empty space in my driveway where my car should have been. They came to my booth and they sat down, and 2 of them sat down on my side of the booth, hemming me into the corner, one on the outside and one beside me. And I noticed it because sitting on a person's side of a booth is not friendliness. It is a maneuver. It is fencing. It is making sure the person cannot easily stand and leave. The older aunt did the talking. Good jewelry, a firm voice, the whole bearing of a woman who has run committees and expects the vote to go her way. She said, "Shauna, we are here as family." I said, "We are not family. The wedding was canceled this morning." She said that is exactly the kind of comment that got us all here. And then she made this speech, and it lasted about 4 minutes. And I could have recited it along with her, in unison, because I had heard the whole of it the night before on a bluff out of a different and younger mouth. She said I was making a very large and permanent decision in a very emotional moment. She said young people today cannot get a foothold that it is not like it was for us that Bradley and Whitney would be renting for the rest of their lives. And then she said, "And you have to admit, Shanna, that house is an enormous amount of property for one person." And the second aunt said, "You are alone out there." And the first aunt said, "You are alone out there, and you are not getting any younger, and God forbid something happens on those stairs." And I sat in that booth, hemmed into the corner with a plum-colored face, and I listened to a third mouth, and then a fourth mouth, say the identical sentence that Whitney had said on the bluff, and that Darlene had breathed over the phone, and I understood in that booth the single most useful thing I learned in the entire year. It was not 4 people independently arriving at the same idea. That does not happen. 4 people do not spontaneously produce the same phrasing. It was a script. Somewhere at some point in somebody's living room, a group of adults had sat down together and worked out in advance how they were going to talk to me. They had agreed on the frame. Old, alone, too much house, cannot do the stairs, not getting any younger, be reasonable for your own sake. And every single one of those sentences is a sentence about my age. Not one of them is a sentence about my property, about my rights, about whose name is on the deed, about what I want. They had together deliberately moved the entire conversation off the question of ownership, where they had no case at all, and onto the question of my age, where they believed they could win. I want to say this next part directly to anyone hearing it who is 65 or 70 or 80. This is how it is done. They do not come at your house. They cannot come at your house because the house is legally yours and they know it. So they come at your age instead. They work patiently to get you to agree out loud that you are old, that you are frail, that you are past it. And the moment you agree to that, the moment you concede that one point, the house stops being a thing you own and becomes merely a detail that you being old are no longer really qualified to have opinions about. That is the whole trick. Guard the first concession. Never let them move you off the deed and onto your age. I let them finish. And then I said Bradley. He had not said one word in 4 minutes. He was looking at the napkin dispenser as if it were the most interesting object he had ever encountered. I said, Bradley, look at me. And he looked at me, and I watched his eyes travel to my bruised cheek and then skid off it sideways the way a car skids on ice. No traction, no ability to hold on the thing. I said, do you have anything you want to say to me? And my son said, Mom, it is 4 hours before the wedding. That was his sentence. Not a defense of the woman who hit me. Not an apology for standing there. Not even honest anger. 4 hours before the wedding. I was not talking about my face. He was talking about a clock. Again. The second time in 18 hours that my son looking at his injured mother had reached for the time. I did not understand it yet. I want to be honest that I sat in that booth and I thought with a grief so heavy it had a physical weight, my son is a coward. My son is simply a weak man who cannot stand up to a strong woman, and that is the whole of it. And I was wrong. I was completely wrong, and being wrong about that being allowed to believe for a few more weeks. That the worst true thing about my son was ordinary cowardice was the last mercy I was going to get, and I did not know to be grateful for it. I put a $20 bill on the table for a salad I had not touched, and I stood up. And the older aunt reached out and took hold of my wrist. I looked down at her hand on my wrist, and I did not pull, and I did not speak. I just looked at it steadily until she took it off. And then I said, the last person in your family who put a hand on me is going to be charged with a crime this week. I would think very carefully about being the second, and I walked out into the sunshine. I do not know what those 140 guests did that afternoon. I have never asked, and no one has ever told me, and there is a version of me that is curious, and a version of me that would much rather keep the not knowing, and the second version has won every single time. I drove home. I took 2 aspirin. I fell asleep in a chair at 6 o'clock in the evening with the phone face down on the side table. And I slept 11 hours straight through, which is the longest I have slept in one unbroken piece since the spring Dale died. Sunday morning came up clear, no fog, which is rare enough on our coast to feel like a small gift. I went out at about 8 to water the pots on the side of the house, and Loretta Pike was already on her side of the back fence in her bathrobe, with her own hose, which is a thing the two of us have done wordlessly most Sunday mornings for 19 years. She looked at my face for exactly 1 second, and then she decided correctly that I would tell her about it when I was ready to tell her, and not 1 minute before, and she let it go, and I loved her for it. We watered. We talked about the dead pine on the corner that the county had been promising to take down for 2 years. She told me her granddaughter had gotten into Cal Poly, and she was so proud she could hardly say it straight. And then, because Loretta Pike is 71 years old and has an absolutely relentless encyclopedic memory for every vehicle that has ever paused on our street, she said the thing. She said, oh, and I have been meaning to ask you, was everything all right last month? I said last month. She said the 10th. A Sunday. Bradley was over at your place the whole morning. I saw the truck. I turned off the hose. I did it slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you have made a decision not to let your own hands become interesting, not to let anyone see anything move. I said the Sunday the 10th. She said that is right. You were at the market, I believe you go early on Sundays. He was there from about 9 until 11. And I only remember it because I thought it was strange. He parked out on the street instead of in your driveway, and Bradley has never once parked on the street in his life. That boy has used your driveway since he was 16 years old. I said, huh. She said, is everything all right, Shauna? I said, I think so, Loretta. That was a lie. It is the only lie I told anyone in the whole of this affair from the first day to the last, and I told it to the one person on earth who deserved it least. And I have never been sorry, because there are things you do not say over a fence on a Sunday morning until you are certain of them, and I was not yet certain. I went inside and I walked down the hall to the built-in cabinet under the stairs where I have kept the household files for 37 years in the same accordion folders in the same order because I am exactly the kind of person you would expect me to be after everything I have told you. Tax, insurance, medical, Dale, and house. The house folder is of the fat one. Purchase documents from 1984. The deed of trust. The reconveyance from 2003, the day I paid it off. The survey. The full legal description of the parcel. And on top of all of it, because I had put them there myself in April, a set of clean, fresh photocopies I had made for the bank when I applied for the line of credit. The legal description. The assessor's parcel number. And a photocopy of my California driver's license, front and back. I know exactly what was in that folder down to the driver's license copy because I made the copies myself at the office supply store on Mission Street in April, and I paid $11.40 for them, and I remember the number because it struck me as a lot for 11 pieces of paper. The folder was there, in its slot, between insurance and Dale. The folder was empty, not disturbed, not out of order, not rifled. Empty and then carefully returned to its exact slot in the exact right place in the sequence, standing upright between insurance and Dale just as it had always stood except hollow. Whoever took what was inside it had taken the time afterward to put the empty folder back where it belonged. I stood in that hallway in my gardening clothes, holding an empty accordion folder open in both hands for a long time. I could not tell you how long. Long enough that the light through the transom moved. Then I went and I sat down at the counter and I opened my laptop and I did the one thing I should have done the night before on that bluff. The instant the number left her mouth and did not do because I had been rather busy being hit. I went to the county assessor's public parcel portal and I typed in my own address, 214 Larkspur Street, and I clicked through to the planning overlays. That is a link that perhaps 400 people in this entire county have ever clicked on in their lives, and about 390 of them do it for a living. And I was one of the 390 for 38 years, and I had not clicked it on my own home in the 3 years since I retired, because why would a woman look up the zoning on the house she has lived in for 37 years? There was a new one, Coastal Infill Overlay, adopted by the County Board of Supervisors on the 4th of March. I read the boundary description twice. Then I pulled up the map layer and I found my own rectangle of land on it, and I traced the overlay boundary with my eye and it ran right down the center line of Larkspur Street. And it turned east at the bluff, and my parcel was inside it. Inside the new overlay by about 40 feet. 40 feet. The overlay changed the permitted density. A parcel that could previously hold one single-family residence could now subject to review hold 4 attached units. I sat back in my chair. $2.6 million. It was not a lie. It was not a bluff. It was not something a greedy young woman had invented on a foggy cliff to frighten a foolish old lady into signing a paper. It was a real number, a true number adopted by a public body on the 4th of March, published on a public website sitting there in the open for anyone in the world to find, including me. If I had ever once in 3 years of retirement thought to look at my own land the way I had spent 38 years looking at 4,000 other people's, I had been sitting on top of it since March. And so it turned out had she. What I felt sitting there was not fear. I want to be precise because the feeling matters. It was the specific feeling you get when you are deep in a file and the last page contradicts the first page. Not alarm, not panic, interest. A very cold, very focused kind of interest. The interest of a person whose entire training has just switched on at once. Because a number like that does not sit still in the world. Numbers like that get pulled. Somebody at some point had run my parcel through a title search or a feasibility study or a broker's opinion of value. Somebody had a printout. And I thought, looking down the hall toward the cabinet under the stairs, you do not steal an accordion folder full of legal descriptions and driver's license photocopies out of a woman's hallway. If all you want is for her to voluntarily sign something over to you later out of love as a gift, you steal the legal description and the driver's license copy if you need them, now, to make a document. Without her. I got up and I put the empty folder back into its slot exactly where it went, standing upright between insurance and Dale, because I did not want anyone who came into my house, anyone at all, to be able to tell that I had noticed it was empty. Then I did the only thing that 38 years at Pacific Ridge Title had actually specifically prepared me to do at that precise moment. I picked up the phone and I called Nadine Calloway at home on a Sunday evening. Nadine has worked in that office for 26 years, and she has never once in all that time been surprised by me, and she was not surprised now. I said, Nadine, I need a full property profile on my own house. 214 Larkspur. The complete chain of title, every recorded instrument going back 5 years. And I need it before you open in the morning. There was a pause. She said, on your own house, Shauna. I said, on my own house. She said, what am I looking for? And I said, I do not know yet. That is exactly why I want to see all of it. I was standing outside her office at 7:50 the next morning with 2 paper coffees in my hands, and I went in and I sat down in the conference room where I had sat for 38 years, and Nadine put a stack of paper down on the table in front of me, and she did not say a single word. She had already looked. I understood that from her face, from her silence, from the fact that there was a yellow adhesive tab already sticking out of the side of the stack. And that was the last hour of my life, in which I still believed that the worst thing that had happened to me was a slap. Nadine had put a yellow tab on page 4. I want you to understand what that meant coming from her. In 38 years at that company working beside that woman, for the last 26 of them, I had never once seen Nadine Calloway put a tab on a page as a courtesy or a convenience or a kindness. You do not tab a page for a friend. You tab a page when the file has a problem, a real one, a title-killing one, and you want the underwriter's eye to go straight to it. A yellow tab in Nadine's hand was a small flag of surrender on behalf of a document. It meant this one does not hold. I turned to it. It was a grant deed. It had been recorded in the official records of San Luis Obispo County at 11:14 in the morning on the 7th of June. Grantor Shanna M. Wilcox, a widow. Grantee Bradley D. Wilcox, a single man. The entire parcel. Not a half interest. Not a joint tenancy. Not a life estate. Not some partial clever thing. All 6/10 of an acre and the 1912 house and the fig tree that never fruited and the rectangle of grass where the swing set stood, the whole of it transferred outright as a gift for no consideration from me to my son. Notarized on the 4th of June by a mobile notary named Curtis Boyle. And down at the bottom above the printed line in blue ink was my name. It was not a bad forgery. I need to be honest about that because people imagine forgeries look like a child did them all wobble in wrongness. This one did not. This one had my slant, that slight backward lean I have never been able to correct. It had the specific way I close the top loop of a lowercase a habit from a penmanship teacher, dead 40 years. Somebody had studied my signature. Somebody had sat down with a real example of it, my actual hand, and practiced over and over until they could produce a passable copy. But the S was wrong. My S has a flat shoulder. It has had a flat shoulder since I learned to write it on a slate in a Catholic school in 1963. Under a nun who rapped your knuckles if the shoulder rounded, and my hand has never once in 60 years let go of that flat shoulder, not when I am tired, not when I am rushed, not ever. The S on that deed had a soft round shoulder. Whoever made it had my slant and my A, and could not have known about a nun in 1963, and so they gave my signature a rounded shoulder that my hand has physically never produced. Nadine said quietly, Shauna. I said that is not my signature. She said, I know. I pulled your reconveyance from 2003 at 6 o'clock this morning and laid the two of them side by side. That is why I tabbed it. I sat there in a conference room I had sat in for 38 years on the wrong side of the table for the first time in my life, and I did the arithmetic because I always do the arithmetic. Recorded the 7th of June, the slap on the 18th of June. 11 days. For 11 days I had watered my pots and slept in my own bed and made coffee for one and driven to the market on Sunday and paid a bank faithfully for a line of credit secured against a house that on paper in the public record of San Luis Obispo County belonged to my son. They had not been asking me for my house on that bluff. That is the thing that reorganized the whole night in my mind, sitting there with the deed in my hands. They had not been asking me for anything. They had already taken it. It was already done. Already recorded, already sitting in the county's official records with a forged blue signature on it. What they wanted from me on that cliff was not the house. What they wanted was a signature to make the taking hold. Nadine turned to the next tab. She had put 2. It was a title requirement letter generated by an underwriter at a different title company on a file where my parcel, my house, was sitting in escrow being sold. I could read it the way you read your own first language fluently without effort, every phrase landing exactly where it was built to land. Requirement 14. The grant deed recorded June 7th is a gift deed recorded within the prior 24 months from a grantor over the age of 65. Underwriting requires prior to close a confirmatory grant deed executed by the grantor before an approved settlement agent, together with the grantor's written acknowledgement of the transfer. Requirement 15. The line of credit encumbering the property must be paid in full and released at closing. Payoff demand may be requested only by the borrower of record. I set the page down flat on the table and I put my hand on top of it, and I understood in 2 paragraphs the entire reason a young woman in a white rehearsal dress had walked me out to a fence in the fog. The insurer would not insure a fresh gift deed out of a woman over 65 without hearing from the woman herself. That is not an obscure or clever rule. That is a completely standard requirement, and it exists word for word precisely because people do to their elderly mothers exactly what had just been done to me. The industry knows. The industry has always known. There is a whole line in the underwriting manual that exists because of the Warren Pruitts of the world. The insurer was going to require the grantor me to walk into an office and sign a confirming deed in front of an approved agent and acknowledge in writing that yes, I had truly given my son my house. And nobody on earth could pay off and release my line of credit but me, the sole borrower of record. They needed 2 things and only 2 things, and they were the 2 things I still controlled. A signature and a phone call to my bank. Whitney had not asked me for a wedding present on that bluff. She had asked me to cure a defect. She had needed me to walk into a title office in the next few days and sign a confirmatory deed and telephone my bank to release the loan so that a sale that was already in escrow to a developer for over $2.5 million could close. That is what the slap was. I understood it finally sitting at that table. It was not rage. It was not even really greed, not in that moment. It was the specific sound a person makes when a closing is coming apart in front of them when the entire structure they have built is resting on one signature from one stubborn old woman, and that old woman has just looked them in the eye on a cliff and said no, not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. The slap was panic. It was the panic of a deadline. Because the requirement letter had a date on it. A date by which items, 14 and 15, had to be satisfied for the deal to hold. The 19th of June. And the rehearsal dinner was the 18th. Now I want to tell you about a book that almost nobody in this country knows exists, and that turned out to be the whole game. Every notary public in the state of California keeps a journal. It is required by law. It is not optional, and it is not a formality. And here is the part that matters, the part I knew, and they did not for any document affecting real property. The law does not merely require the signer to sign the notary's journal. It requires a thumbprint. The right thumb in ink pressed onto the line next to the signature in the book. Government Code Section 8206. I have subpoenaed those journals in my career. I have sat across conference tables from notaries and watched them turn the pages with gloved hands. In 38 years, I have probably examined 40 of them, and I will tell you that the thumbprint requirement is the single most hated line in the entire notary code because signers find it insulting and notaries find it tedious. And it exists anyway over all of that objection for one reason and one reason only, which is that a signature can be practiced and a thumbprint cannot. You can sit at a table for a month and learn to forge my hand. You cannot forge the ridges on the end of my thumb. The law knew that. The law put the one unforgeable thing in the book and then made the book available to any member of the public who could name the date and the parties and the document, and I could name all 3. And there is a subsection that even most people in my own industry forget because they never have occasion to use it. Any member of the public may request a certified copy of a specific line entry from a notary's journal in writing, provided they can identify the date of the act, the names of the parties, and the type of document. I had all 3. Every one of them was printed right there on the face of the forged deed. The date, the names, the type. I wrote the letter that same afternoon at my counter in my own flat handwriting with its flat-shouldered S-certified mail return receipt requested. Curtis Boyle Mobile Notary at an address in Arroyo Grande, 20 minutes down the coast. I requested a certified copy of the single journal line entry for the 4th of June grantor Shanna M. Wilcox grant deed. And then I drove it to the post office myself, and I watched the clerk stamp it because I was not going to trust a thing this important to a mailbox. Then I called a lawyer. Douglas Renfro is 58 years old, and he does nothing and has done nothing for 30 years but real property litigation. I had sat across from him in closings and disputes for 2 decades on the opposite side of the table, usually mildly annoyed with him, because he is a blunt, heavy, unsmiling man who does not make the small sounds of sympathy that grease ordinary conversation. He read my file in 11 minutes in his office with his half-moon glasses down on his nose, and he did not make a single one of those sympathetic sounds the entire time, and that is precisely why I hired him. He set the last page down and he said, "You understand that this is not a family dispute." I said, "I understand that it is a crime." He said, "It is both." But I need to know which one you want to be first, because they move at very different speeds. And if you try to run them at the same time from the start, you will trip over your own feet. I said, first I want the deed gone. Then I want the people. He nodded once as if I had passed a small test, and he went to work. On the 22nd of June, he filed a quiet title action to establish in law that I was and had always been the true and continuous owner of the parcel. A separate cause of action to cancel the instrument, the forged deed itself, and a claim for financial elder abuse under the section of the Welfare and Institutions Code that carries with it, and this matters the right to recover attorney's fees from the people who did it. And the same afternoon, he recorded a notice of pendency of action. That last document is only 4 pages long, and it does more work than everything else combined. It is a lease pendens. And the moment it is recorded against a parcel, the entire world is put on legal notice that the title to that property is in active litigation. No lender will fund against it. No title company will insure it. Nothing closes. It drops onto a pending sale like an anvil through a table. I had spent my entire career watching those things land on other people's deals, watching a lis pendens turn a clean file into a dead one in a single afternoon. It felt very strange and not entirely unpleasant to be for once the one dropping it. 3 days later, my home telephone rang at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was a man's voice, no introduction, already halfway into being furious before I had finished saying hello. He said, "Is this Wilcox?" I said, "This is Shanna Wilcox." He said, "My name is Hollis Crane. I run a company called Sandhill Ridge Partners. There is a lis pendens sitting on a parcel that I am under contract to purchase for $2,580,000, and I would very much like for somebody to explain to me what in God's name is going on." That is how I learned the buyer's name. That is how I learned the price. $2,580,000 from an angry developer at 7 o'clock in the morning, who had quite reasonably assumed that I was part of whatever scheme had just blown up his deal. I said, "Mr. Crane, do you have a moment?" He said, "Ma'am, I have got all morning." And I told him. All of it flat in order the way I would have briefed an underwriter on a bad file. This Sunday the 10th. The empty folder. The forged deed recorded on the 7th. The slap on the 18th. The overlay adopted on the 4th of March. I laid it out for him event by event, and I did not editorialize because the facts did not need my help. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Ma'am, I have been buying dirt in this county for 31 years, and I have never once had one of these come out of a seller's own family." Then he said, "Who signed my purchase agreement?" I said, "My son did." He said, "God Almighty." And then he said a thing that I have turned over many times since, a thing that pushed the whole timeline back further than I had understood it. He said, "For whatever it is worth to you, you should know that somebody brought this parcel to me back in April. In April, ma'am, with a boundary survey and a density study already done, already paid for, already in a folder. I made my offer off of that package. April. The offer had been made in April. 2 full months before the forged deed was even signed on the 4th of June. They had marketed my land to a developer with a completed density study 2 months before they manufactured the document that would let them sell it. This had not been a scramble. It had been a project. The envelope from Curtis Boyle came on the 12th of July. I opened it standing at my counter, 1 page certified with his notary seal embossed at the bottom. And I want to tell you about Curtis Boyle because it turns out he is important, and it turns out he did everything right. And it is precisely because he did everything right that he was the one who brought the whole thing down. He had done his job perfectly. Every column in that journal line was filled in the same careful, steady, slightly cramped hand. The date of the act, the type of document, the fee he charged, the exact time, the signature of the person who appeared before him, and in the last column a thumbprint, a right thumbprint in black ink pressed onto the line exactly as the law requires. I have very small hands. I have had small hands my whole life, could never span an octave on my mother's piano. The thumbprint pressed into that book was wider than mine by half again. It was not remotely my thumb, but that was not what stopped my breath. The thumbprint alone told me the signer was not me, but I had already known the signer was not me. I had known it since the round-shouldered S. The identification column stopped my breath. It read California driver's license, and then a number. I know my own driver's license number. I have written it on 20 forms this year alone, on the bank loan application, on the medical intake at the clinic, everywhere. I looked at the number in Curtis Boyle's book for a long time. 2 of the digits were reversed. The 7th and 8th characters swapped. Not wrong, not made up, reversed, transposed. And that is the tell that is the thing that a person who has read paper for 38 years knows in her bones. You do not misread a plastic card that is sitting in your own hand and transpose 2 digits. When the card is in your hand, you copy it straight. You transpose 2 digits when you are copying a number off of a piece of paper, a photocopy 1 character at a time, with your eyes traveling back and forth between the source and the line, and somewhere in that back and forth, your eye trips and swaps too. I thought about an accordion folder in a hallway emptied and put back in its slot. I thought about a photocopy of my driver's license front and back made at the office supply store on Mission Street for $11.40. And then I read the very last column. Notaries are trained to write a short description of the signer if anything about the transaction is unusual or if the identification gives them any pause. Curtis Boyle had written 6 words. Female white hair, mid-60s cardigan. I sat down on the floor of my own hallway with my back against the cabinet under the stairs and my legs went out in front of me on the boards. Whitney Rademacher is 31 years old. Whoever had sat down in front of Curtis Boyle on the 4th of June and pressed a right thumb into his journal and read my driver's license number off a photocopy 1 careful digit at a time and signed my name with a rounded shoulder on the S was a woman with white hair in her mid-60s in a cardigan. I did not have a name. A thumbprint is not a name and a 6-word description is not a name, and I was not going to accuse anyone on the strength of a cardigan. What I had was a category. A woman in her mid-60s with white hair who had a reason to want my land badly enough to forge a deed for it. And when I sat on that floor and made the list in my head, the list of white-haired women in their mid-60s, with a reason the list was very, very short. But I was not going to move on a guess. I had spent 38 years watching people lose because they moved on a guess instead of a fact. So I waited, and it took 3 days. On the 15th of July at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Darlene Rademacher came up my front walk carrying a lemon cake on a plate covered with a dish towel. I watched her come from the front window, and I need to be very careful in how I tell you the next part, because I did the next part deliberately, and I did it legally, and the fact that I could do it legally is one more thing that 38 years of reading paper had put into my hands. California is a 2-party consent state. You cannot record a private conversation without the consent of everyone in it. I have known that my entire working life it is bedrock, but there is a section, Penal Code 633.5, that permits one party to a conversation to record it lawfully without the other person's consent. When that party has a reasonable good faith belief that the recording will produce evidence of certain specific crimes. And extortion is on that list. A demand for the transfer of property backed by force is extortion under California law. And I had a police report and a clinic record and a straight rail-shaped bruise across my shoulder and a forged deed. I had reasonable grounds 10 times over. I called Douglas Renfro before she reached the door, and I asked him one question, and he took about 9 seconds and said on these facts, "Yes, you may. Put the recorder on the table and do not lie to her about anything." So I set my small recorder face down on the porch table next to the sugar bowl, and I turned it on and I went and opened the door. And she was lovely. That is the part I still find hard all this time later. She was so lovely. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my face. She said the cake was from the bakery on Mission that she knew I liked. She said she had been just sick about all of it, that families should never do this to each other, that she had told Whitney 100 times to leave the whole business of the house alone. I poured us iced tea. I did not accuse her of one single thing. I asked her ordinary questions, the kind of questions an entirely innocent woman answers without a flicker of hesitation, without even really thinking about them. I said, when did the 2 of them first start looking at condominiums? I said, did you know they had actually put in an offer on something? I said, Darlene, when did you first hear the word resoning? And she talked. People do. She was so relieved, so genuinely relieved that I was being reasonable, that I was not screaming, that I had let her onto the porch at all, that she filled every silence I left open for her, the way a nervous, kindly, guilty person will. And then I said very gently, I understand there was some kind of paperwork. And Darlene Rademacher said, oh, honey, I know. I told Whitney at the time that doing it on a Friday was a mistake, because the notary had to drive all the way out from Arroyo Grande, and it was a Friday afternoon, and everyone was in such a rush. The porch went very quiet. Even the ocean 4 blocks off seemed to hold still. I said, Darlene, who told you the notary came out from Arroyo Grande? And her face did a thing I will remember until the day I die. It did not go pale first. That is what I expected, and it is not what happened. It went blank first. It went completely smoothly blank, the way a screen goes blank when the power is cut, all the expression wiped off it at once. and then a full second later, it went pale. Because there were exactly 3 people on this earth who knew that Curtis Boyle had driven out from Arroyo Grande on a Friday the 4th of June to notarize a document. The notary himself, the person who had hired and paid the notary, and the person who had sat down in front of him and pressed her thumb into his book. And I had not been one of those 3 people until 11 days ago when a certified letter arrived and told me. I had never spoken the word Arroyo Grande or the word Friday or the word notary to Darlene Rademacher or to anyone in her family ever. I said I never told you there was a notary. I never told you where he came from. I never told you what day it happened. And you just told me all 3. She started to say something about Whitney. She got as far as Whitney handled all of the. And I reached across the porch table, and I turned the recorder face up so that she could see the screen and see the number on it still climbing. I said that is 51 minutes. She stood up so fast that her chair scraped back on the boards, and her glass of iced tea went over and ran off the edge of the table. I said, Darlene, take your cake. I do not want it in my house. She left it. She left the cake and the dish towel and the puddle of tea, and she went down my front walk faster than a woman of 66 has any business moving, and she got into her car and she did not manage to close the door properly on the first try. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that as clearly as I can because I think people expect that I did, and I did not. I sat on that porch for an hour after she was gone, and I shook the way my hands had shaken in the parked car 3 weeks before, and the ice melted in 2 glasses. And I thought about a soft, pleasant woman in a eucalyptus grove resting her hand on my forearm, telling me I had done a beautiful thing. I copied the audio file 3 times that night onto 3 separate small drives because Warren Pruitt taught me never to have only one of anything that matters. The next morning, I drove it to Detective Sharon Mabry at the Port La Bend station, and it went into the criminal file where it belonged. Renfro, when I told him, was blunt about the civil side, and he was right to be. He said, I will use that recording to know where to dig. I will not hang your case on it. Your case is not a tape of a frightened woman on a porch. Your case is the notary journal and a handwriting examiner because those 2 things will still be exactly as true in a courtroom 11 months from now, no matter what. Any defense lawyer wants to argue about consent or context or a recorder on a table. I was right. And in the end, it did not even come to that. Because on the 9th of August, when the county sheriff booked Darlene Rademacher and rolled her right thumb across an ink pad and onto a fingerprint card, it matched the print in Curtis Boyle's book. I never needed a name from that journal after all. The journal had simply been waiting patiently in a drawer in Arroyo Grande for her to come to it. Discovery is a slow, boring machine, and it is the single most powerful thing an ordinary person in this country has, and almost nobody knows how to use it, and I had spent 38 years watching it work. In August, Renfro subpoenaed the entire escrow file from the officer handling the sale, a man named Trent Mallory. 600 pages came back. The purchase agreement between Bradley D. Wilcox and Sandhill Ridge Partners. $2,580,000. A density study dated the 6th of April. Correspondence. Wire instructions. All of it. I read all 600 pages myself at my own counter over 4 days with a legal pad beside me and a pencil in my teeth because I was the only person in that case who had read 1,000 escrow files in her life, and I was not about to pay a young associate $200 an hour to skim past the one thing that mattered. I found it on the 19th of August on page 411, and I almost turned past it because by the 4th day my eyes were tired and the pages had begun to blur into one another. And that is exactly how these things get missed on the 4th day when the reader is tired and the document is buried on page 411 of 600, which is precisely why they had not worried about it. It was not a document. It was a photograph of a document. At some point in the spring, Whitney had needed to send Trent Mallory a single page of the density study, and she had not been near a scanner, and so she had done what everyone does now. She had photographed the page with her phone on a table at a slight angle in a hurry and emailed the photograph. It was in the file because everything is in the file because escrow keeps all of it. You could see the edge of the table in the photograph. You could see the corner of a coffee cup, and underneath the bottom edge of the page she was photographing, sticking out about 1.5 inches into the frame plainly accidentally, was another piece of paper. A yellow sticky note. 3 lines of handwriting on it upside down in the photograph, but perfectly, completely legible. I have known that handwriting since it was learning to make a lowercase g. I have a shoebox in a closet with 25 years of Mother's Day cards in it, in that exact handwriting going back to a card made of construction paper and dried macaroni. It was Bradley's. 3 lines, it said. Mom signs by the 19th. Tell Crane we are clear. Do not push her before the dinner. I set the page down flat on my counter, and I put both of my hands on it, one on either side, and I held on to the counter. The rehearsal dinner was the 18th. Do not push her before the dinner. My son had written that. My son had set the date the 19th. My son had known there was a deadline, had known that somebody was going to have to push me his mother into signing, and had written down in his own hand on a yellow note an instruction that the pushing should wait until after his rehearsal dinner so that it would not spoil his evening. Whitney had jumped the gun. She had pushed a day early. That is what went wrong on the bluff. That is the thing I had actually witnessed on my son's face. He was not frozen. He was not in shock. He was not, it turned out, a coward. And I had spent 8 weeks grieving a coward, and I had been grieving the wrong thing. It was a man watching a carefully built schedule come apart in front of him in public, in front of witnesses, 12 hours ahead of when it was supposed to happen. That is why he looked at his watch on the bluff. That is why he looked at his watch in the diner. He was not checking the time out of nervousness. He was not fidgeting. He was checking how much of it was left. He was doing arithmetic. His mother was standing in front of him bleeding, and my son was calculating how badly Whitney's timing had damaged the plan, and whether it could still be recovered before the 19th. For 8 weeks I had carried around the belief that my son was weak. And I want to tell you, weak is survivable. I had made a kind of peace with weak. You can forgive weak. Weak is a thing that happens to people, a failure of nerve, a freezing up, and a mother can hold a weak son and mourn the strength he did not have and love him anyway. There is no version of do not push her before the dinner that is weak. That sentence was written by a person who had thought carefully about his mother's feelings and calculated their timing and scheduled them the way you schedule a delivery you would rather not be home for. He had known it would hurt me. He had planned around the hurt. He had wanted the hurt to arrive on a convenient day. I did not cry then, either. I have thought about why, and I think it is because a thing that large does not come out as tears. It comes out as a kind of stillness. I went out and I sat on my own back steps and I looked at the rectangle of grass where the swing set used to be, the grass that came in a different green, because the ground remembers, and I stayed there until it was fully dark and I could not see the fence anymore, and then I went inside. The civil case never went to a full trial. There was nothing to try. On the 15th of October, the judge in Department 7 of the San Luis Obispo County Superior Court granted our motion for summary judgment. Renfro spoke for about 4 minutes. There was genuinely nothing to argue about. We had a notary journal with a thumbprint that was not mine sitting next to a driver's license number, that was not mine sitting next to a 6-word physical description, that was not me. We had 2 handwriting examiners who agreed independently on the round-shouldered S, and we had a defendant who was by then already criminally charged. And the law itself on this one narrow point is beautifully unusually simple. And it is one of the very few places in the law where the thing is exactly as fair as ordinary people hope the law will be. A forged deed in California is void. Not voidable. Void. From the beginning. As if it had never existed at all. It does not transfer anything to anyone ever. Not to my son. And crucially, not even to an innocent buyer who paid full price and knew nothing about the forgery, because a thief cannot pass good title to a thing the thief never owned. A forged deed is not a weak link in the chain. It is a link that was never there. The chain simply does not connect across it. The court ordered the instrument canceled and expunged from the record. And when the clerk recorded that order, the chain of title on 214 Larkspur Street closed back up over those 11 days, like water closing over a stone dropped in a pond. On paper today in the official records of the county, I owned that land continuously without a single break from 1984 until the day I chose to sell it. Those 11 days do not exist anymore anywhere except inside me. I am the only remaining record of them. The criminal cases took a great deal longer the way criminal cases do. Darlene Raidmaker was charged with forgery, with procuring the recording of a false instrument, with a false personation, and with elder abuse. She went to trial the following May, and the jury was out under 4 hours. She is the one who signed my name. She is the one who put on her own white hair and a cardigan, and drove to a rented office and pressed her thumb into a book, and read my driver's license number off a stolen photocopy, 1 digit at a time, and transposed 2 of them. The pleasant woman in the grove with her hand on my forearm. It was her hand on my land before it was ever on my arm. Whitney pleaded the following July to a count as an accessory and to a separate count of battery upon me. My son pleaded in November of that first year to 1 reduced count, and he received probation and restitution. I want to talk about the letter I wrote because it is the thing people ask me about most, and it is the thing I am least certain I got right, and I would rather tell you about it myself than have you wonder. I wrote to the Deputy District Attorney handling the case, and I said two things. The first thing I said was that I did not want a prison sentence for my son, that I would say so in open court if asked, and that I meant it, and that I was not saying it to be seen saying it. I did not want Bradley in a cell. I have never wanted that, not for 1 hour of this. And then I said the second thing. I said that I would not be dismissing the civil claim against him, not reducing it, not deferring it, that he would pay on a schedule out of his own wages for years. Some people found that cold. My own lawyer asked me twice if I was sure, and I want to explain it because the reason is the whole of who I decided to be. I stood up at the sentencing and I read 3 sentences from a single sheet of paper, and then I sat down. I said my son did not take my house from me. Other people did that, and they are being punished for it, and that is right. I said my son wrote down the day it was supposed to happen, and then arranged the schedule so that it would not interfere with his dinner. I said I am not asking this court to punish him for greed. I am asking it only to notice that he was capable of planning around my feelings in writing, and that he chose to plan around them instead of protecting them, and that he did it while I was borrowing money against that very house to pay for his wedding. Then I sat down. He did not look at me. I did not need him to. That is why the civil claim stands. Not for the money. I did not need his money, as you are about to see. It stands because a debt that arrives every month on a schedule for years is a thing that cannot be forgiven in a single warm afternoon and then forgotten. It is a standing acknowledgement in the only language my son turned out to actually understand, which is the language of scheduled obligations, that what he did had a cost, and that the cost is real, and that it is his to carry. I gave him in the end a deadline of his own. It seemed only fair. There is one more thing I want to say about the sentencing because I have thought about it since on the porch in the evenings. A reporter had gotten hold of the outline of it by then the way they do, and there was a small piece in the county paper, no names of mine, just the shape of the thing, a retired title officer, a forged deed, a family. And after it ran, I began to get letters. Not many, a handful from women I did not know, all of them old, all of them frightened, all of them writing to ask the same thing in slightly different words. How did you know to look? What made you check? I gave everything away in the end, they seemed to be saying, and I only found out after, so how did you find out before? And I wrote back to every one of them the same short answer, which was that I did not find out before, either that I found out 11 days too late, and that the only reason it turned out differently for me was that I happened to have spent 38 years learning to read the one document that could put it right. That is not a thing most people have. That is not a thing anyone should need. And that is the whole reason for the last part of this story, the part about the money. In December, escrow opened. On the 8th of January, it closed. I sold 214 Larkspur Street to Sandhill Ridge Partners for $2,640,000. Hollis Crane and I negotiated the whole of it ourselves across a table in 4 meetings, and not once did that man try to use against me any of what he knew about my situation, which is a great deal more than I can say for certain members of my own former family. He shook my hand at the end, and he said it had been a pleasure doing business with somebody who read the documents, and I believe he meant it as the highest compliment he had. We closed at Pacific Ridge Title in the same conference room where I had worked for 38 years. Nadine handled the file. I read every single line of the escrow instructions out of habit and out of love for the work, and I found 2 errors in them. Small ones, a transposed figure and a misstated recording fee, and I corrected both, and Nadine looked at me over her big square glasses and said, "Of course you did." After the line of credit was paid off, and the fees came out, and the taxes on the gain came out, I was left with a little over $1.5 million. The money Whitney wanted came to me. It came to me through my own 2 hands, out of my own signature, the real one with the flat-shouldered S that a nun beat into me in 1963, and that no one in the world has ever been able to forge because they did not know a small dead woman in a habit who is the reason I still own everything I own. In February, I bought a 2-bedroom house 6 minutes walk from the water on a flat street with no stairs at all. And I want to be clear about the stairs because it matters. I did not choose the flat street because anyone told me I was too old for stairs. I chose it because I liked the house and because I was tired of stairs. And there is a very great difference between deciding a thing for yourself and having it decided for you by people who want what is at the top of your particular staircase. The stairs were always mine to give up. They were never anyone else's to take. There is a porch. There is room on it for 2 chairs. In March, I gave $250,000 to the County Recorder's Property Fraud Alert program. That is a real thing, and almost nobody knows it exists, and that is the whole tragedy of it. You register your name and your parcel number with the county recorder, and from that day forward, the moment any document is recorded against your property, the county sends you an email. That same day. It is free. It takes about 4 minutes to sign up. And it would have told me on the 7th of June at 11:15 in the morning, 1 minute after that forged deed was recorded that a grant deed had just been filed against my home. It would have collapsed 11 days into about 11 minutes. The money did not buy the system. The system already existed, sitting there quietly unused the way these protections always sit there unused. What the money bought was a person. One full-time outreach coordinator whose entire job is to drive around this county to the senior centers and the mobile home parks and the church basements and the rec halls with a laptop under her arm and to sign people up in the room one at a time while she is standing right there to answer their questions. In the first 8 months, she registered 940 people. 4 of them received an alert. 2 of those 4 alerts were forgeries caught before escrow stopped cold. 2 families still have their houses because a woman with a laptop drove out to a rec hall on a Tuesday. I have met one of them, an old man named Walcott, who reminded me so much of Warren Pruitt that I had to sit down. He did not lose his house. He got the email the same afternoon the deed was filed, and he called his daughter, and his daughter called the sheriff, and it was over in a week instead of a lifetime. He did not know my name. He did not need to. That is the whole point of it. The protection does not need you to know who paid for it. It just needs to arrive on time. Loretta Pike was the very first person in the county to sign up. She made me put her name down before I had even finished explaining what it was reaching across the table, for the pen saying, well, obviously, Shauna obviously put me down. I did it for a reason, and I want to be honest that the reason is not charity, or at least not only charity. For 11 days I lived in a house that was not on paper mine, and I did not know it, and there was no reason on earth that I would have known it. The tax reassessment notice would not have come for months. Nobody in a courthouse is assigned the job of driving out to tell you. 11 days is a long time. 11 days is more than enough time to close an escrow to move money to be gone. Now it is an email. The same afternoon. Arriving to a woman standing in her own hallway, in her gardening clothes with a hose still dripping in her hand, telling her that something has been recorded against her home while there is still time to do something about it. That is what the money bought. It bought other people their 11 minutes so that they will never have to find out the way I found out what a person can do with 11 days. The last part is short. On the 12th of November of the second year, a Sunday, I looked out the front window of my new house and Bradley was standing on the sidewalk. He did not come up the walk. He stayed on the public side of the property line on the sidewalk, which I noticed, and which I believe he intended me to notice. It was in its way the most fluent thing he had ever said to me, my son, who thinks in schedules and boundaries and lines. He was telling me with his feet that he understood there was now a line and that he was not going to cross it uninvited. He had been in therapy for 12 months by then. Not court-ordered. He had started it himself the same month he pleaded, and I knew that not because he told me, but because it came up once sideways in a letter from his lawyer, and I had turned it over many times. I went out. Neither of us moved to hug the other. He said, I am not here to ask you for anything. I said, all right. He said, I have been paying. It is on time every month. I am going to keep paying all of it for as long as it takes. I said, I know, I see it, I do see it. And then he stood there for a while looking at the street, at the leaves, at anything gathering himself. And then he said the only thing he had actually come to say. He said, do you think there will ever be a Sunday? The ocean was doing its thing 4 blocks over. Somewhere down the street, a leaf blower started up and then stopped. And I thought about a 9-year-old boy in a borrowed navy blazer at a graveside, asking me whether we were still a family. If there were only 2 of us, and I thought about what I had told him, that a family is whatever number of people are still showing up, and I thought about how completely he had failed on the 18th of June to show up, and how carefully in his own handwriting he had planned that failure in advance. And I told him the truth, which is that I did not know. I said, Bradley, I do not lock my front door in the daytime. I never have. If you come by on a Sunday, the door will be unlocked, and you can knock, and I will very probably answer it. He nodded. He had heard the shape of it, the size of the opening, which was small and real, and he was smart enough finally not to reach for more than was being offered. And then I said the other half of it because he had earned one honest sentence from me if he had earned nothing else in this life. I said, but I am not going to give you a key. He said, no, I know. He got into his truck. He parked in the driveway that day I noticed, not on the street. A small thing. Perhaps the only apology he was ever going to be able to make in a language I could read. I went back up onto my own porch, and I sat down in one of the 2 chairs, and I put my feet up on the rail, and I looked out toward a strip of the Pacific Ocean 4 blocks away that I do not own and never will and do not need to. I am 70 years old now. I have a house that nobody gave me and that nobody can take. And every so often on a weekday afternoon, my telephone buzzes with an alert from the county recorder telling me that no documents have been recorded against my property. It is the most boring notification I receive. Nothing has happened. Nothing has been filed. All is exactly as it should be. I read every single one of them start to finish, and then I set the phone face down on the little table and I look at the water, and I am for that moment, and a good many others, now completely and entirely at peace.